The story of Atlantis originates from two dialogues written by the Greek philosopher Plato around 360 BCE, known as Timaeus and Critias. In these texts, Atlantis is described as a powerful maritime civilization that existed beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The implication is historical memory, but the limitation is that Plato is the sole primary source. Plato presents Atlantis not as a mythological tale, but as a historical account allegedly passed down through Egyptian priests to the Athenian lawmaker, Solon. This transmission suggests a chain of preservation. However, no independent Egyptian records confirming Atlantis have been identified, creating a critical evidentiary gap for investigators. According to Plato, Atlantis existed approximately 9,000 years before Solon's time, placing it around 9600 BCE. This date predates most known complex civilizations. The implication challenges established timelines of human development, while the limitation lies in the absence of archaeological evidence supporting advanced societies from that period. Atlantis is described as a technologically advanced society with monumental architecture, complex canals, and a powerful navy. These features imply a high level of organization and engineering. However, no physical remains matching this description have been conclusively found, limiting the claim to literary description rather than material proof. In Plato's account, Atlantis ultimately fell out of favor with the gods and was destroyed by earthquakes and floods in a single day and night. This suggests a sudden natural catastrophe. The limitation is that no geological event of such scale has been definitively linked to a lost civilization matching Atlantis. Scholars debate whether Plato intended Atlantis as a literal historical account or as an allegory to illustrate moral and political ideas. This raises an investigative implication about authorial intent. The limitation is that Plato never explicitly clarifies whether Atlantis should be read as factual history or philosophical narrative. The location of Atlantis is described as beyond the Pillars of Hercules, commonly associated with the Strait of Gibraltar. This geographic reference implies a real place in the Atlantic Ocean. However, ancient geographic terminology was imprecise, limiting certainty about the exact area Plato intended to describe. Plato contrasts Atlantis with ancient Athens, portraying Athens as virtuous and Atlantis as morally corrupt despite its power. This narrative structure suggests symbolic storytelling. The limitation for historians is distinguishing between moral contrast and historical reporting within a philosophical text. No Greek historian contemporary to Plato, including Herodotus or Thucydides, mentions Atlantis. This absence raises questions about its historicity. The implication is selective sourcing, while the limitation is that silence in other records does not definitively disprove existence. Ancient Egyptian civilization kept extensive records, yet none explicitly reference a civilization matching Atlantis. This absence challenges Plato's claim of Egyptian origin. The limitation is that many Egyptian records have been lost, leaving open the possibility of missing documentation. Archaeological methodology relies on material remains such as tools, structures, and settlements. Atlantis, as described, would likely leave significant traces. The lack of such evidence implies non-existence or misidentification, but the limitation is that submerged or destroyed sites can be difficult to detect. Some researchers argue Atlantis could represent a memory of real natural disasters, such as large-scale floods. This suggests cultural transmission of catastrophe. The limitation is that correlating mythic narratives with specific geological events remain speculative without direct evidence. Plato's Critias dialogue ends abruptly, leaving the Atlantis narrative incomplete. This creates uncertainty about the intended conclusion. The implication is that crucial contextual information may be missing, while the limitation is that no continuation text has ever been recovered. The precision of Atlantis description, including measurements and urban layout, has been cited as evidence of realism. However, ancient authors often use detailed descriptions in fictional works. The limitation is that descriptive detail alone cannot establish historical authenticity. The story of Atlantis has survived for over 2 millennia through repeated copying of Plato's texts. This continuity implies lasting significance. At the same time, textual transmission introduces risks of alteration, limiting confidence that the surviving version reflects the original account exactly. During antiquity, some philosophers accepted Atlantis as historical, while others rejected it as fiction. This early division indicates ambiguity from the start. The limitation is that ancient scholarly opinion varied widely and was often influenced by philosophical alignment rather than evidence. Roman-era writers rarely expanded on Atlantis, suggesting limited acceptance. This silence implies skepticism or lack of interest. However, the limitation is that many Roman texts have not survived, reducing the completeness of the historical record. Medieval scholars largely ignored Atlantis, focusing instead on theological narratives. This gap implies loss of continuity in investigation. The limitation is that absence of discussion may reflect cultural priorities rather than conclusions about Atlantis' validity. Interest in Atlantis resurged during the Renaissance, when classical texts were re-examined. This renewed attention implies unresolved questions. The limitation is that interpretations during this period often blended emerging science with speculation. Early modern scholars attempted to reconcile Atlantis with biblical chronologies. This suggests efforts to integrate Plato's account into known history. The limitation is that such attempts were constrained by theological frameworks rather than empirical investigation. By the 19th century, Atlantis became associated with emerging ideas about lost civilizations. This reflects broader curiosity about human prehistory. The limitation is that archaeology was still developing, and many conclusions from this era lacked methodological rigor. Advances in geology introduced the concept of deep time, challenging Plato's proposed timeline. This created tension between textual tradition and scientific dating. The limitation is that geological evidence does not directly address specific cultural narratives like Atlantis. Oceanographic exploration in the modern era mapped much of the Atlantic seabed. This reduced the likelihood of large unknown landmasses. The implication is constraint on possible locations, while the limitation is that smaller or eroded sites could remain undetected. Despite extensive exploration, no submerged continent matching Atlantis has been found. This absence narrows interpretations. The limitation is that Plato may not have meant a continent in the modern geological sense. Linguistic analysis of Plato's Greek suggests deliberate rhetorical construction. This implies philosophical intent. The limitation is that rhetorical style does not exclude the possibility of historical reference. Some scholars propose Atlantis was inspired by earlier Greek myths of lost lands. This indicates cultural synthesis. The limitation is that mythological influence does not automatically negate historical foundations. The consistency of Atlantis' destruction narrative resembles known flood myths. This suggests a shared human response to catastrophe. The limitation is distinguishing symbolic storytelling from recorded history. No definitive artifacts, inscriptions, or settlements have been linked to Atlantis. This remains the central investigative barrier. The limitation is that absence of evidence cannot conclusively resolve the question. As a result, Atlantis occupies a space between philosophy, history, and legend. This ambiguity sustains ongoing investigation. The limitation is that interdisciplinary approaches still rely on the same limited primary source. At the end of this contextual phase, Atlantis remains defined by a single ancient account, extensive debate, and persistent gaps. The implication is unresolved historical uncertainty, while the limitation is clear. Without new evidence, Atlantis cannot be confirmed nor entirely dismissed. Modern archaeological investigation approaches Atlantis through comparative analysis, searching for real sites that might align with Plato's description. This implies Atlantis could be a distorted memory of an actual place. The limitation is that no candidate site matches all geographic, chronological, and cultural details simultaneously. One frequently examined hypothesis links Atlantis to the Minoan civilization on Crete and the island of Thera, modern Santorini. The implication is that Plato's story reflects a real Bronze Age society affected by catastrophe. The limitation is that the Minoans existed thousands of years later than Plato's proposed date. The volcanic eruption of Thera around 1600 BCE caused widespread destruction in the Aegean. This provides a documented natural disaster. However, the limitation is that the eruption did not sink a continent, nor erase an entire civilization in a single day, as described by Plato. Archaeological evidence shows the Minoans were seafarers with advanced architecture and trade networks. This parallels some aspects of Atlantis. The limitation is that Minoan cities do not match Plato's concentric city layout or Atlantic location. Other researchers have proposed Atlantis was located near Spain, particularly around the region of ancient Tartessos. This suggests a Western Mediterranean origin. The limitation is that Tartessos declined gradually and lacks evidence of sudden destruction by flood. Geological surveys of southern Spain reveal ancient floodplains and tsunamis. This supports the idea of catastrophic events. However, the limitation is that such events do not confirm the existence of a highly advanced lost civilization. Some hypotheses place Atlantis in the Atlantic near the Azores. This relies on submerged plateaus and islands. The limitation is that geological data shows these formations are volcanic and never formed a large inhabited landmass. Plate tectonics demonstrate that continents do not sink rapidly. This scientific framework constrains literal interpretations of Plato's account. The limitation is that Plato may have used non-literal language, complicating geological evaluation. Underwater archaeology has expanded significantly with sonar and remote vehicles. This improves detection capabilities. However, the limitation is that extensive surveys have not revealed urban remains consistent with Atlantis. Investigations of ancient coastlines show sea levels were lower during the last ice age. This implies now submerged coastal settlements may exist. The limitation is that such sites would be small, not a vast empire as described. Some scholars argue Atlantis represents a composite of multiple societies remembered collectively. This implies cultural memory rather than a single location. The limitation is that composite models are difficult to verify archaeologically. Ancient oral traditions often compress time and exaggerate scale. This could explain discrepancies in dates and size. The limitation is that Plato provides specific figures, suggesting intentional structure rather than oral distortion. The lack of inscriptions referencing Atlantis is a major obstacle. Literate civilizations typically leave written records. The limitation is that destruction does not always erase all textual traces, raising doubts about total loss. Comparative mythology shows parallels between Atlantis and Near Eastern flood narratives. This suggests thematic borrowing. The limitation is that shared motifs do not equate to shared historical events. Scientific skepticism toward Atlantis increased with the professionalization of archaeology in the 20th century. This reflects stricter evidentiary standards. The limitation is that absence of acceptance does not equal definitive disproof. Some geological formations, once cited as ruins, were later identified as natural structures. This demonstrates the risk of misinterpretation. The limitation is that early claims damage the credibility of Atlantis research. Satellite imagery has been used to identify potential ancient sites. This expands investigative tools. However, the limitation is that anomalies require excavation to confirm cultural origin. Funding and institutional support for Atlantis research is limited. This constrains systematic exploration. The limitation is that lack of resources reduces opportunities to test unconventional hypotheses. Mainstream archaeology prioritizes sites with corroborating evidence. Atlantis lacks this support. The implication is methodological exclusion, while the limitation is that unconventional discoveries can initially appear unsupported. Attempts to date Atlantis using ice core and sediment data face interpretive challenges. These records show climate events, but not cultural details. The limitation is connecting environmental data to specific societies. Plato's philosophical goals complicate historical analysis. He used narratives to illustrate political ideals. The limitation is separating illustrative fiction from potential historical reference. Some researchers argue Plato intentionally exaggerated scale to emphasize moral decline. This implies narrative construction. The limitation is that exaggeration cannot be quantitatively measured. The absence of contemporaneous corroboration remains critical. No external records align with Plato's timeline. The limitation is reliance on a single source. Archaeology depends on falsifiable claims. Atlantis, as defined, resists testing. This limits scientific engagement. The implication is methodological stagnation. Despite skepticism, periodic claims of discovery continue. This reflects enduring interest. The limitation is that none have withstood peer review. Media representations often conflate speculation with evidence. This obscures serious investigation. The limitation is public misunderstanding of scholarly consensus. Academic discourse increasingly frames Atlantis as a case study in myth and memory. This shifts focus from location to meaning. The limitation is that historical questions remain unresolved. Interdisciplinary studies attempt to integrate geology, history, and literature. This broadens analysis. The limitation is conflicting methodologies and conclusions. No single hypothesis currently satisfies textual, geological, and archaeological criteria. This highlights investigative limits. The limitation is that criteria themselves are debated. At this stage of investigation, Atlantis remains unsupported by material evidence yet persistently examined. The implication is ongoing uncertainty, while the limitation is unchanged. Without new data, conclusions cannot advance. The enduring presence of Atlantis in modern culture influences how historical mysteries are perceived. This impact shapes expectations of discovery and loss. The implication is that public imagination can pressure research directions, while the limitation is that cultural fascination does not substitute for empirical validation. Comparisons between Atlantis and other lost cities, such as Troy, are often made to suggest eventual discovery. Troy was once doubted, but later excavated. The limitation is that Troy had multiple independent references, while Atlantis relies on a single literary source. The case of Troy demonstrates how myth and history can intersect. This implies Atlantis could follow a similar trajectory. However, Troy's location and time frame were broadly consistent across sources, a condition absent in the Atlantis narrative. Human fascination with vanished civilizations reflects concerns about fragility and collapse. Atlantis symbolizes sudden loss. The limitation is that symbolic relevance does not increase historical probability. Atlantis is often cited in discussions of climate change and sea level rise. This creates modern relevance. The limitation is that projecting contemporary concerns onto ancient texts risks misinterpretation. The narrative of sudden destruction resonates with known prehistoric flooding events. This suggests collective memory. The limitation is that memory alone cannot reconstruct specific civilizations. Academic caution persists because extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Atlantis meets the first criterion, but not the second. The limitation is that evidentiary standards prevent speculative conclusions. The absence of physical remains limits not only confirmation, but also falsification. This keeps Atlantis in a suspended state. The limitation is methodological paralysis. Atlantis research illustrates how history depends on surviving evidence. What is lost cannot be tested. The implication is epistemological uncertainty, while the limitation is irreversible absence. Some scholars argue Atlantis should be studied as literature rather than archaeology. This reframes the question. The limitation is that it avoids addressing historical possibility directly. The persistence of debate reflects unresolved tension between text and material record. This tension defines the case. The limitation is that neither side can conclusively prevail. Advances in underwater exploration may change future assessments. Technology evolves. The limitation is that technological capability does not guarantee relevant discoveries. Even if a submerged site were found, proving it is Atlantis would remain difficult. Identification requires textual alignment. The limitation is interpretive ambiguity. Atlantis challenges assumptions about historical certainty. It exposes how much depends on documentation. The limitation is that unknowns cannot be quantified. The narrative continues to inspire investigation despite repeated negative findings. This persistence implies unresolved questions. The limitation is diminishing returns without new evidence. Atlantis functions as a boundary case for historical inquiry. It marks where evidence ends and interpretation begins. The limitation is recognizing that boundary without crossing into speculation. The discipline of history prioritizes probability over possibility. Atlantis remains possible but improbable. The limitation is that probability assessments change with evidence. Public interest ensures Atlantis will remain discussed. This sustains discourse. The limitation is that popularity does not equal validity. The lack of closure is central to Atlantis' endurance. Questions remain open. The limitation is that openness can invite distortion. Atlantis illustrates how narratives survive independently of verification. This separation defines its status. The limitation is unresolved authenticity. No current model fully explains Plato's detailed account without contradiction. This suggests complexity. The limitation is interpretive insufficiency. The debate over Atlantis reveals how history is constructed from fragments. It highlights methodological dependence. The limitation is fragmentary survival. Atlantis continues to be cited as both warning and wonder. These interpretations vary. The limitation is interpretive plurality. The absence of definitive answers reinforces investigative humility. This is a methodological consequence. The limitation is acceptance of uncertainty. Atlantis remains neither confirmed history nor dismissed fiction. It occupies an intermediate category. The limitation is categorical ambiguity. The question of Atlantis persists because it cannot be resolved with existing data. This defines its status. The limitation is evidentiary finality. As long as no new sources emerge, conclusions will remain provisional. This constrains scholarship. The limitation is dependence on chance discovery. Atlantis serves as a reminder of the limits of historical knowledge. Not all pasts are recoverable. The limitation is permanent uncertainty. The mystery endures not because of answers, but because of their absence. This absence defines the investigation. The limitation is unresolved inquiry. The facts are real. The explanation is up to you.